Audio, video. Yep.
All right, kids. I think we're going to get started. We still have people hopping on, but we're at 108, so I think we'll get started. So quick introductions and a little bit of housekeeping, and then I'm going to turn it over to Rachel, and then Rachel will turn it over to DougTallamy. So first, I am Mindy Wheeler. I am the I'll say program manager, I guess, of the Utah Pollinator Habitat Program. And just to let you all know, the application period is now open. It opened on the 1st. So go ahead and put your applications in for free native plants to help out those pollinators. I have put you all on mute. You can use the chat. We will sort of play it by ear at the end of the webinar here in terms of taking people off mute. It's just a lot of people to manage. We're up to 117. So I am going to go ahead to turn it over to Rachel.
Hello there, and I run Utah Friends of Monarchs, where we have been sharing milkweed and seeds and seedlings for about a decade now, actually. And I'm so pleased to have DougTallamy speak with us. And I'll just let you know that one thing is we will send out an email following this presentation, and it will have the recording in it, but it'll also have some information because the Pollinator Habitat Program has some free seedlings, pollinator seedlings that we're giving away, and that will be locations throughout the state, literally from Roosevelt to Cedar City to Logan at Salt Lake. So, and there is a link in the chat for the Utah Pollinator Program where you can make that application. They are open now. So moving forward, I'm going to go ahead and introduce Doug, and DougTallamy is the T.A. Baker Professor of Agriculture in the Department of Entomology and Wildlife Ecology at the University of Delaware, where he has authored 115 research publications and has taught insect-related courses for 45 years. Chief among his research goals is to better understand the many ways insects interact with plants and how such interactions determine the diversity of animal communities. His books include Bringing Nature Home, The Living Landscape, which is co-authored with Rick Dark, Nature's Best Hope, my personal favorite, and a New York Times bestseller, The Nature of Oaks, winner of the American Horticulture Society 2022 Book Award, and his latest book called How Can I Help, which I just pre-ordered on Amazon, so take note. In 2021, he co-founded Homegrown National Park with Michelle Alfandari, and that is, we'll be sending you a link to that as well in the follow-up email, but it's homegrownnationalpark.org. His awards include recognition from the Garden Writers Association, Audubon, the National Wildlife Federation, Allegheny College, Eco-Foresters, the Garden Club of America, the Herb Society, and the American Horticultural Association. And with that, let's welcome Dr. Tallamy. Thank you so much, Doug.
All right, thanks a lot, Rachel. Well, tonight we're going to talk about nature's best hope, at least what my idea of nature's best hope is. And I'll give you a spoiler, you're nature's best hope. So I'm really going to tell you about why I think so. Before I do that, though, let's talk about what E.O. Wilson's idea of nature's best hope was. Of course, a very famous entomologist at Harvard. He died 2 years ago, but he had a huge impact on the world of insects and conservation and biodiversity and sociobiology. He started entire disciplines himself. But one of the things that was consistent throughout his very long career was his love of life on planet Earth and his efforts to save it. And he wanted to save it not just because he loved it, but because he knew it was essential to our own survival. So in 2016, he wrote this book, Half Earth, Our Planet's Fight for Life, and he had one simple message. He said, if we're going to save life anywhere on planet Earth, and I think most people would agree we want to do that, we're going to have to save nature. We're going to have to save functioning ecosystems on at least half of the planet, or it will disappear everywhere. And that includes humans. very bold message. And he spent most of the book talking about the science that supports that very bold message. And then he ended the book. He didn't spend a lot of time telling us how we were going to save nature on half of planet Earth. Of course, to a conservation biologist, that's a great idea. We'll just put half the Earth aside, and all those things that are in trouble can be in one half, we can be in the other half, and it'll be great. Problem is, half of Earth, terrestrial Earth, is already in some form of agriculture. And we've got 8.2 billion people in the other half, along with all of our hardscape and airports and detritus. And we don't have a third half to put aside for nature. So how can we realize E.O. Wilson's dream? That's really what I want to talk about tonight. And I think we can. But we need a new approach to conservation to do that. Before we talk about that, though, let's talk about what happened in the East in 2019, and again a couple of years later, and maybe last year, was it? It happened across the entire country. We had a very large oak mast where members, particularly of the red oak group, got together and decided to make their acorns at the same time. And this is what it looked like in a lot of places. Well, I'm easily entertained, so I took one of those acorns and I just stared at it. But I was rewarded because an insect started to chew its way out of the acorn. First, it chewed a little hole for its head, then it forced its head through there, then it forced its entire body through that hole. It was a tight squeeze. And once it's out of the acorn, it's a dangerous time for that larva because it's good to eat. A lot of things are after it. So it gets to safety by wiggling and squirming beneath the soil surface. That takes about 30 seconds. And once it's underground, it stretches in all directions and forms a chamber. And within that chamber, converts itself to a pupa. And then surprisingly, stays in that underground chamber as a pupa for 2 years. After 2 years, comes out as an acorn weevil. That's what an acorn weevil looks like. A lot of people think weevils have big noses because it looks like they do. But that's actually an extension of the head capsule. And the mouth parts are way down here at the end of that extension. They take those mouth parts, chew a hole into the center of the acorn, turn around, lay an egg in it, and that is how the larva gets into the acorn. Why do they spend 2 years underground? Why don't they come out the next year the way most insects would? Well, it takes red oak acorns 18 months to complete their development. So if they came out the next year, there wouldn't be enough acorns for them. Once they leave the acorn, it leaves a hole. It's kind of like a true vacuum. Aristotle told us that nature abhors a vacuum. And in this case, she has filled it with 3 species of temnothorax ants, tiny little ants where the entire colony lives in the holes made by acorn weevils after they have left the acorn. And if scouts find a new hole in a new acorn, they get all excited because their old acorn is falling apart. So they tell everybody it is time to move, time to grab the larvae, grab the eggs, move the entire colony into the new acorn. That takes about 30 minutes. Then they post a guard to make sure nobody else comes in. And that's where they'll live for the next 2 years until that acorn falls apart. What's my point with this little story? That's just one of literally millions of very specialized interactions, largely between animals and plants, that comprise the bulk of nature. This is another one, the relationship between jays and acorns. Jays are the primary disperser of oak acorns. They'll take an acorn and fly sometimes a mile and a half from the parent tree. Then they tap it below the surface of the soil. And the object is they're going to go back in the wintertime and have something to eat. But for every 4 acorns they bury, they only remember where one is. So for every 4 acorns they bury, they've actually planted 3 oak trees. And a single jay can bury 4,500 acorns every fall. Specialized relationship between pileated woodpeckers and carpenter ants. That's what they rear their young on, carpenter ants. So you won't have pileated woodpeckers unless you have a lot of carpenter ants, and you won't have a lot of carpenter ants unless you have the big trees that make those carpenter ants. You won't have this beautiful moth, the beloved Emarginia, unless you have mistletoe, and you won't, that's their host plant. And you won't have mistletoe unless you have the oaks to support that mistletoe. There are 60 species of western native bees that won't be there if you don't have the pollen from perennial sunflowers. And it turns out that pollen specialization is very common in our native bees. We've got between 3,600 and 4,000 species of native bees, and over a third of them can only reproduce on the pollen of particular plants. So I could talk all day, all week, all year about nature-specialized relationships, but the point I want to make tonight is that actually most of these relationships these days are in trouble. They're on the ropes. Nature itself is on the ropes. And it's on the ropes because we didn't take Teddy Roosevelt's advice. Way back in 1908, Teddy heard that the state of Arizona was going to mine the Grand Canyon. So he went to the canyon, looked out over the edge, and he said, leave it as it is. And with those 5 words, he started the process of creating the Grand Canyon National Park. Well, we didn't leave most of the country as it was, particularly the lower 48 states. There's only about 5% that's anything close to its original pristine ecological condition, and those are typically mountaintops. And you got some of that in Utah there. And that's because we have logged the country repeatedly. We have tilled it. We have drained it. We have grazed it. Got 770 million acres of rangeland in this country. That is 4.5 times the size of Texas, dedicated to cattle. And of course, we paved it or otherwise developed it. We have straightened our rivers and dammed them. You can spell that any way you want. We polluted our skies, changed our climate for centuries to come. We've drained our aquifers. We've introduced more than 3,300 species of plants from other continents, many of which are running amok in our natural areas. In short, we've carved up those natural areas into tiny remnants of their former selves, and each one of those remnants is too small and too isolated to sustain the amount of nature that E.O. Wilson was talking about, the amount of nature necessary to keep us alive on this planet. Edwin Wade Teal decades ago said we cannot make the world uninhabitable for other forms of life and have it habitable for ourselves. It's the most basic common sense. So why have we done this? I don't know, but I suspect that we thought that our nest, planet Earth, was so large we could foul it forever and there wouldn't be any consequences. But of course, we were wrong about that, and that's why we're seeing some pretty upsetting headlines these days, like the insect apocalypse is here. What does it mean for the rest of life on Earth? Talking about global insect decline. Followed by this one, North America's lost 3 billion breeding birds in the last 50 years. That's a third of our North American bird population already gone. And let me remind you what a billion is, in case you're not a billionaire. It's 1,000 million. So 3,000 million birds fewer now than just 50 years ago. The UN's predicting that we're going to lose 1 million species to extinction in the next 20 years, and they made that prediction 3 years ago. So now I guess it's the next 17 years. It's a prediction, hasn't happened yet, and we have to make very sure it doesn't happen because these are the species that do keep us alive on this planet. So I could go on talking about the pox that we humans have delivered upon the environment, as Shakespeare would say, upon all of our houses. But that's not what this talks about. This talks about a cure for that pox. It's a cure that'll take small efforts from lots of people like you and me. But those efforts will deliver enormous physical, psychological, and environmental benefits to everybody. Let's return briefly to this headline, the insect apocalypse is here. What does it mean for the rest of life on Earth? Well, back to E.O. Wilson. He told us exactly what it would mean if we lost our insects, and he did it way back in 1987 with this paper, The Little Things That Run the World. And again, his message was very clear. Life as we know it depends on insects. And if they were to disappear, so would most of our flowering plants. And if most of our flowering plants disappeared, that would so drastically change energy flow through our terrestrial ecosystems that the food webs that support our vertebrate animals would collapse. We would lose our amphibians, our reptiles, our birds, and our mammals. The biosphere, the living portion of the Earth, would rot because we would have lost insect decomposers that rapidly turn over nutrients, and all we would have is bacteria and fungi. And of course, humans wouldn't survive any of those drastic changes. There's good news. There's good news, and that is that none of that has to happen. We can save our insects. We can save our birds. We can save nature itself, but we're going to have to change the way we landscape to do it. Why is that? Well, remember, humans are products of nature. We are totally dependent on the life support that ecosystems provide. We call them ecosystem services. Here are just a few things that plants do every day that we depend on every day, like oxygen, pretty important, clean water. Plants are cleaning the water that falls from the sky and slowing its journey to the sea where it becomes too salty to use. Carbon capture, enormously important today. Plants build their tissue out of carbon dioxide, the carbon they pull from carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, out of harm's way. And then they pump the extra carbon that they fix through photosynthesis into the ground where it's extremely stable, can stay for thousands of years if we don't turn over the ground. Plants are building topsoil, they're holding it in place, they're preventing floods, they're dampening severe weather, they're converting sunlight into food. You know, if we lose our plants, we're going to have to eat sunlight. Then we'll lose weight. What do animals do for plants? They provide pest control services. They pollinate nearly 90% of our flowering plants. They disperse plant seeds. So designing landscapes like this that destroy the production of ecosystem services is just not a good idea. Never was a good idea, but it's a terrible idea because of those 8.2 billion people demanding more and more ecosystem services every day. Now, we do have parks, we do have preserves, and they're doing the best they can, but we are in the sixth great extinction event the planet has ever experienced, so it's obviously not good enough. So I think what we have to do is start practicing conservation outside of parks and preserves on landscapes just like this. Now, there have been visionaries through the ages who've recognized that we humans needed to work on our relationship with planet Earth, and Aldo Leopold was one of the most eloquent. He wrote extensively in the first half of the 1900s. One of the things he said is the oldest task in human history is to live in a piece of land without spoiling it. There have been indigenous groups have been good at doing that for long periods, but our huge Western societies and our huge Asian societies are terrible at doing that. We habitually take more from the land than it has to offer, completely wrecking an area, going to another area, doing the same thing, not sustainable behavior. But Aldo Leopold had a lot of faith in humans. He believed we were capable of developing what he called a land ethic. He knew we had to use the land. We had to farm and lumber and graze and mine and do all of those things. But he believed we could learn to do them gently enough that we did not destroy local ecosystems. That's what he called the land ethic, and he wrote about it in the Sand County Almanac, his most famous book. What he did not write about was developing a land ethic where we actually lived. And I'm not sure why that was, but I suspect the notion that humans and nature cannot live together. We cannot coexist in the same place at the same time. That notion was so deeply embedded in the culture of Aldo Leopold's day, still embedded in our own culture, unfortunately, that I don't think he recognized it as an option. But not only is living with nature an option today, it's now the only viable option that's left to us. Now, in the past, conservationists worked pretty much exclusively where there weren't a lot of people. We now need to turn that on its head and practice conservation where there are a lot of people, because that's pretty much everywhere. And that means we've got to find ways for nature to thrive in human-dominated landscapes. Not hang on by a thread, but thrive. Where should we start? Well, private property. Why? Because most of the country is privately owned. 78% of the entire country is privately owned. 85.6% east of the Mississippi is privately owned. 95% of Texas is privately owned. If we don't practice conservation on private property, we're going to fail, and failure is not an option. Now, when I use the word conservation, I'm not using it exactly the way I mean. We do want to conserve any bits of nature that are left out there. That has been our conservation model for the last century, and we want to keep doing that. But it's obviously not good enough. So we have to go beyond conservation now into restoration. We have to rebuild nature in as many places as we possibly can. And somebody will say, well, gee, there's no way you're going to put it back together again exactly the way it was. And they're probably right. We've changed too many things. But we can reunite enough of those specialized interactions that I opened the talk with to create a functional ecosystem once again, even if it's not exactly what was on that space at some point in the past. But in order to do that, we have to start with the building blocks. Not all species contribute to ecosystem function equally, so we have to start with the most important groups. And there's two groups we can't do without. One is the flowering plants, and of course the pollinators that allow those plants to reproduce. They are capturing energy from the sun and through photosynthesis turning it into simple sugars and carbohydrates, which is the food that supports just about all the animals on the planet. So now we have the food that animals need locked up in plant tissues, mostly leaves. If we don't get that food to animals, you don't have any animals. And if you don't have any animals, you don't have any functional ecosystems. Well, it turns out that most vertebrates don't eat plants directly. Most vertebrates eat invertebrates that ate plants. Most of those invertebrates are insects, and not just any insect. Caterpillars turn out to be enormously important in terms of transferring energy from plants to other animals. As a matter of fact, they are transferring more energy from plants to other animals than any other type of plant eater. So if we design landscapes that don't support a lot of caterpillars, we're going to have failed food webs and eventually failed ecosystems. I'm going to use the Carolina chickadee as an example because that is the chickadee that is at my feeder all winter long and breeding in my yard all summer long. There are species of chickadees as you move around the country. You may have the mountain chickadee, but they're all pretty much the same bird doing the same thing. And one of the things they do is come and eat seeds in the wintertime. We tend to think that is all chickadees need. But in fact, even in the wintertime, only half of their diet is seeds. The other half is insects and spiders, even in the wintertime. And when it comes time to reproduce, their babies can't eat seeds at all. That's true for most of the birds out there. Babies cannot eat seeds, so they switch to invertebrates, and if they're in a healthy environment, they will rear their young exclusively on caterpillars, and they are not exceptions. 96% of our terrestrial birds rear their young on insects, and most of those insects are caterpillars. Excuse me. So, something special about caterpillars. What is it? There's actually several things special about caterpillars. One of them is that they're soft. So think of this guy as if he's a little sausage with a very thin wrapper. The thin wrapper is exoskeleton. It's made of chitin. It's undigestible. And because they're soft, you can stuff them down the throat of your offspring without fear of injuring them. And if you've ever watched a parent bird rear their young, they're pretty rough. Beaks like a plunger. They can just stuff it down there. They're also large, relatively large prey items. One medium-sized caterpillar is equal to the biomass of 200 aphids. Now, some of our smaller birds do chase aphids around. Oops. But do you want to chase 200 aphids or get one caterpillar? They're nutritious. They're very high in fat, very high in protein, low percentage of chitin, of exoskeleton compared to other insects, particularly beetles. Beetles are not like little sausages. They're like little tanks. So much of a beetle is undigestible, and many beetles have very sharp edges too. And then finally, caterpillars are the best source of carotenoids for birds, particularly during the breeding season. And I mention carotenoids not because I love organic chemistry, but because I'm a vertebrate, and you're a vertebrate, and birds are vertebrates. And we vertebrates cannot make our own carotenoids. Only plants make carotenoids. So we have to get our carotenoids from plants. And we have to get them from plants because carotenoids are essential components of vertebrate diets. Where are the birds getting their carotenoids from? Well, they're getting them from the prey items that they bring back to the nest. But look, carotenoid content is not equally distributed among bird prey items. These first two bars here are types of caterpillars. They have far more carotenoids than other types of bird prey. Here are the adult caterpillars here, the moths and butterflies themselves. They have far fewer carotenoids because they're not eating the green leaves. That's where the carotenoids are. And here's the earthworm way over here. So the early bird gets the worm, but he doesn't get any carotenoids when he gets the worm. And there's also evidence that there's a direct relationship between how often a prey item is brought back to the nest and its carotenoid content. Caterpillars are brought back more often than anything else, and they have the highest carotenoid content, followed by orthopteroids, things like crickets and grasshoppers and katydids. And then everything else that has very low carotenoid content is brought back far less frequently. So those studies and others are suggesting that caterpillars are not optional parts of most bird diets. They are essential parts of most bird diets. So let's just say most birds need caterpillars. The next question is, how many do they need? Is one or two enough? Or one or two a day enough? Good question. So let's go back to Carolina chickadees. There's a lot of data on Carolina chickadees. How many caterpillars does it take to make a nest of Carolina chickadees? One or two is not enough. One or two a day is not enough. It takes thousands, 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars to get one clutch of chickadees to the point where they leave the nest, where they fledge. And after they fledge, the parents continue to feed them caterpillars another 21 days. But they're flying all around, so nobody's been able to count them. But it really amounts to tens of thousands of caterpillars required to make one nest of a bird that's 1/3 of an ounce. That's 4 pennies worth of bird. And if you want chickadees to breed in your yard, you got to have all those caterpillars in your yard because they only forage about 50 meters from the nest. They are not flying 5 miles down the road to the nearest woodlot. That takes way too much energy. And that is true for most birds. They forage very close to the nest. And if we landscape in a way that does not include all those caterpillars, that's called insect decline. And it's really looking like insect decline is one of the major reasons birds are declining. We went to the original data set of Rosenberg et al. That is the Smithsonian group that said we have lost 3 billion breeding birds in the last 50 years. And we divided the terrestrial bird species into 2 groups, the species that require insects, particularly when they're breeding, and the species that do not require insects. So things like doves and finches and crossbills can actually make a little milk out of the seeds they eat, and they can rear their young on that. And look, that group did not lose any numbers at all in the last 50 years. But the group all the species that require insects lost on average 10 million individuals per species. This doesn't prove cause and effect, but it does suggest that as you take bird food away, you lose the birds. And it's not just little birds that need insects. This is a kestrel eating a nice sphinx moth. This is an ornate box turtle loving caterpillars. These guys, they're not common anymore, but they used to chase cutworm and armyworm populations around and eat hundreds of caterpillars a day. So I think we need to raise the bar about what we're asking our landscapes to do. In the past, we've asked them to do one thing, be pretty. Now we're going to ask them to do two things, be pretty and ecologically functional at the same time. But there's no way they're going to be ecologically functional unless we put the caterpillars back. So how do you add caterpillars to landscapes? Well, you put the plants that support those caterpillars into those landscapes. But there is a catch, and that is that most plants do not support a lot of caterpillars. So we have to be fussy about which plants we choose, and we have to be fussy about it because the caterpillars themselves are fussy about it. And the monarch butterfly illustrates that perfectly. You can have all the crepe myrtle and all the camellias and all the whatever Asian plants you landscape with in Utah in your yard, and you won't support a single monarch butterfly. The only thing that's going to support a monarch butterfly is one of the milkweeds. That's called host plant specialization, and it turns out that most of the insects that eat plants are host plant specialists, just like the monarch. So the question is, why? Why is everything specializing? And the answer is that plants have made them specialize. Plants don't want to be eaten. They want to capture the energy from the sun and use it for their own growth and reproduction. So they've loaded their tissues with nasty tasting chemicals, secondary metabolic compounds that make those tissues either bitter or downright toxic. And it's a really effective defense that keeps most of the insects of the world from eating most of the plants of the world, which is why it's green out there in the summertime. Not because there's no insects out there. It's that most of the insects that are out there cannot eat most of the plants. They are too well protected. There's a reason it's hard to get our kids to eat their vegetables. They inherently know they're toxic. But we do know that insects eat plants. So how do they do that? How do they get around those chemical defenses? Well, this is where the specialization comes in. 90% of the insects that eat plants are host plant specialists, and they can only eat the plants for which they have the adaptations that allow them to circumvent those plant defenses. The enzymes that store and excrete and detoxify those compounds, behavioral adaptations and life history adaptations that minimize the insect's exposure to those compounds. But it takes a long period of interacting with those plant lineages for all those adaptations to fall into place. And once they do, the insect is locked into eating that particular plant. So if you take the milkweeds out of your yard and replace them with hostas, the monarch is not going to start to be able to develop on hostas. It's locked into eating milkweeds, and it has two choices then: fly away and find milkweed someplace else, or starve to death. Turns out there's three types of plants out there. Plants that contribute energy to local food webs. Remember, they're capturing energy from the sun, turning it into food, and then if they pass it on into the food web, they have contributed energy that helps support everything else. There are plants that don't do that. They don't contribute any energy, and they're plants that actively remove energy from local food webs. The very best contributor in 84% of the counties in which they occur is one of our oaks. They're contributing more energy to local food webs than anything else. I believe you have the Gamble oak there. Not a lot of oak diversity, but it's still a very important plant. Good example of a non-contributor would be a ginkgo. Ginkgo biloba, favorite ornamental around the country, has good fall color, but nothing eats a ginkgo. So it's not adding any energy to local food webs. And a good example of a non-contributor would be any of the ornamentals we brought in that have escaped to become invasive species in our natural habitats. We have examined caterpillar populations in habitats that have been invaded by various plants, and on average, there's a 96% reduction in caterpillar biomass. So if you think of caterpillars as bird food, you've just reduced bird food by 96%. All I'm trying to say here is that plant choice matters. There's no way we're going to rebuild ecosystems if we don't have functional food webs within those ecosystems. And there's no way you're going to have a functional food web in the ecosystem unless you choose the right plants. And I'm going to give you 3 examples of how well this works when you do choose the right plant. Starting with what's happened at our house where my wife Cindy and I live. This is what it looked like when we moved in the year 2000. It was 10 acres of a farm that had been broken up into 10-acre lots. It's a very old farm, been farmed over 300 years. The last thing they did was mow it for hay. So not much there. And our job was to restore it, to rebuild the eastern deciduous forest that ought to be here, which we did not know how to do. We'd never done that before. But one of the things I wanted to discover is if I planted the host plant of a host plant specialist, would it find my little patch and colonize it? And the one I chose was Canadian owlet. I'd never even seen a Canadian owlet. That's what one looks like. The adult looks like a leaf. Well, you're not going to have Canadian owlets unless you have their host plant, which is meadow rue. And we didn't have any meadow rue. I'm sure it was growing there 300 years ago before the area was farmed to death, but the meadow rue was long gone. So I got some meadow rue seeds from someplace and I planted them. It grew very nicely. But this was early on, and I actually had very little faith that Canadian owlets would appear out of nowhere and colonize my meadow rue. So I didn't even go out and check it. It was at least 2 months after I planted it. Then I was walking by for another reason, and I looked over. It was covered with Canadian owlets. They had found it right away. I'm still impressed with that. So now we have a good population of Canadian owlets and meadow rue. We've added 2 species to that barren landscape. Same story with the goldenrod stowaway. That actually is a misnomer. This beautiful moth has nothing to do with goldenrod. It is a specialist on this plant, Biden's aristosa, ditch daisy. We didn't have any Biden's aristosa, but I did know where there was some Bidens in a power line cut about 14 miles away. So I collected some seeds, planted them at home. They grew very nicely. As a matter of fact, last year they took over my front yard. That's okay. I had to wait a year for the goldenrod stowaway to find my patch of Bidens, but they did, and now we've got a good population of both of those. So we've added 4 species to the property. Wanted to see if the hackberry emperor could make a living at our house, not because it's the most beautiful butterfly in the world, but because it belongs there. It's one of the species that ought to be there. But as its name suggests, it's a specialist on hackberry, on Celtis. We didn't have any hackberry. So I got some hackberry trees, planted them. We had to wait 4 years for the hackberry emperor to find my hackberry, but they did. And now we get a good population of those. So we've added 6 species, and that's how the restoration proceeded. I did not plant goldenrod. It came in on its own. And along with it came many of the things that require goldenrod, like the beautiful brown-hooded owlet, the Arcigera flower moth, the goldenrod leaf miner, the distinct Sparaginothus, the goldenrod gall moth. There are 110 species of moths, just moths, that need goldenrod in the mid-Atlantic states. I planted Virginia creeper. A lot of people don't like Virginia creeper in the East. I don't know why. It's a great native plant. It's got good fall color. It can climb our trees without girdling them, without pulling them down. It's a good ground cover. It makes valuable berries for the birds in the fall. And by valuable, I mean they are high in fat. Our migrating birds need sources of fat to fuel that migration, and our overwintering birds need sources of fat to get them through the winter. And these berries come from inconspicuous, tiny little flowers. You don't even know that Virginia creeper is in bloom until you see this big cloud of native bees around it. Turns out that Virginia creeper is an excellent pollinator plant. So remember, when you're making a pollinator garden, you're making it for the pollinators. If it's not big and showy for you, that's okay. I planted Virginia creeper because it's the best host plant for the large sphinx moth caterpillars that are a primary component of cardinal diets. Things like Pandora's sphinx and its beautiful adult, the lettered sphinx, the hog sphinx, the abbot sphinx, all on Virginia creeper. Want to see if I get the evening primrose moth to make a living at our house because it's beautiful. I like beauty like anybody else. Well, as its name suggests, it needs evening primrose, and we didn't have any. So I planted that. Moth did come, spends the day with its head stuffed in the flowers. Sometimes it's crowded, but it's always very cute. And I planted lots of oaks. Now, these are just examples of the plant lineages that we put on our property. But I want to focus on oaks for a while because they are such important plants. This is the Bedford oak in Bedford, New York, Martha Stewart land. People argue about whether it's 400 years old or 500 years old. It's enormous. And I hear people say, I'm not going to plant an oak because I won't live long enough to enjoy it. And if you can only enjoy your oak when it's 400 years old, you're right, you won't. But if you can enjoy what your oak is contributing to our local food webs, you can enjoy it right away. And I can say that with confidence because I planted most of my oaks as acorns, which means they were free, or as 2-foot bare root whips, which means they cost $1.50 each. And immediately they started to call in the moths that create the caterpillars that support the food web at my house. Things like the solitary oak leaf miner, Juvenil's dusky wing, the yellow-shouldered moth, Suzuki's promolactus, the red-washed caterpillar, the yellow-vested moth, the orange-tufted oneida, the spiny oak caterpillar, the two-spotted oak punky, the variable oak leaf caterpillar, the red-humped oakworm, the pink-striped oakworm, the hesitant dagger moth, the medium dagger moth, the lesser oak dagger moth, the medium dagger moth, the greater oak dagger moth, the streaked dagger moth, the afflicted dagger moth, the crown bucolatrix, the orange patch smoky wing, the white blotch heterocampa, the oblique heterocampa, the red line panapoda, the laugher, and literally hundreds more species have come to the oaks on our property, and they come right away. This is a pin oak that has just popped its head above the leaves, and here's a caterpillar standing on the ground eating the leaves of that tree. And somebody might say, oh no, it's going to kill the tree. No, it's not, because an ovenbird is going to come eat that caterpillar in the next 10 minutes. This little guy is contributing to the local food web, and it didn't take decades or hundreds of years for that to happen. It's what our house looks like in the summertime these days, taken from pretty much the same place I took that first picture. Just to give you an idea, we put some of the plants back. Not all of them, still working on it. But the question is, has life returned? Well, you can measure life any way you want. I measure it in two ways: the number of breeding birds on the property and the number of bird food, the number of moths that make the caterpillars that support those breeding birds. So I've been taking pictures of every moth species I have found on our property for the last 8 years. I am still at it, but I'm up to 1,337 species of moths so far. Who knows how many that will be? And we have 10 acres. Pennsylvania is, it's either 22.9 million acres or 29.2 million acres. It is much bigger than our property. Yet we have 44% of all the moths that occur in the entire state. And because so many of these are types of bird food, we have recorded 62 species of birds that have bred on our 10 acres. Not flew by, but bred. Why am I telling you this? Because this is another headline we see all the time. World Wildlife Fund says that 2/3 of Earth's wildlife have vanished since 1970. I love the word vanish, as if, poof, they're gone. We've killed them. We've killed 2/3 of Earth's wildlife. But I'm thinking, gee, not at our house. I'm convinced we have increased biodiversity by more than 2/3. It didn't take that long, and it wasn't that hard. We just put the plants back. What would happen if everybody put the plants back? We really could turn headlines like this around. But will it work on smaller properties, let's say in suburbia? Very good question. So let's go to Margie and Dan Terpster's house in Kirkwood, Missouri. They have 0.6 acres, 18 times less land than Cindy and I have. They're in the middle of a development. Everybody around them has the big lawns. And when they moved into their property, it was thoroughly choked with Amur honeysuckle, another invasive bush honeysuckle. So the first thing they did was get rid of that. Then they planted 70 species of native plants, put in a water feature that they call a bubbler, and then they started to count the birds. They count everything, but they're focusing on the birds that are now using their properties. Whoop, oh, that is behind. They're up to 154 bird species, including 35 warbler species. Now, we've recorded 18 warbler species at our house. But remember, we've got a lot more property than they do. So does it work on smaller properties? Absolutely. What about urban yards? Well, how about Pam Carlson's house in Chicago? She's got 1/10 of an acre, and that 1/10 of an acre abuts O'Hare Airport. So she is really in Chicago. She's not connected to any natural area at all. So she's a little island in Chicago. It's a pretty island because Pam is a native plant landscaper and she knows how to do it. But she did the same thing. She removed her non-native plants, put in 60 species of native plants, added a water feature, and then she sat back and started to count the birds using her yard, and she's up to 127 species. I got to update these slides here. 127 species of birds have used her yard, including a woodcock. There's Pam's woodcock. So if you haven't seen a woodcock lately, go to Pam's house in Chicago. Okay, there's 4 things we need to think about if we're going to succeed in a big way And we need to succeed in a big way. And one of them is we got to shrink the big lawns that we have. We got 44 million acres of lawn nationwide. That's an area bigger than New England, dedicated to an ecological deadscape. Now, I know people in Utah are not the big offenders here, but it's a national problem, so we'll talk about it anyway. 44 million acres of ecological deadscape. Why do we do that? It is a status symbol. It's a very important status symbol. We like neat, and we gotta have a place to display our Halloween decorations. Remember, there are four things that every landscape needs to, four ecological challenges that every landscape needs to meet if we're going to reach that sustainable relationship with Mother Nature. And we have to. Every landscape has to support a viable food web. Every landscape has to remove carbon from the atmosphere and tie it up in plants and pump the extra carbon into the ground so we can help climate change. Every landscape has to manage the watershed in which it lies, and every landscape has to support pollinators. Lawn does none of those things, which is why I pick on it. So what if we cut the area of lawn in this country in half? What if we took spaces like this and turned it into this? I got this picture from Dan Getman, who lives in Missouri. He had this big lawn, and he decided to start planting native plants. So he sent me this picture. Well, let's make the math simple. Let's say we got 40 million acres. We're going to cut that in half. That'll give us 20 million acres that we can restore right at home, which is enough area to create what I'm calling homegrown national park. And it will be big. It'll be bigger than the Adirondacks, plus Yellowstone, plus Yosemite, plus Grand Tetons, Canyonlands, Mount Rainier, North Cascades, Badlands National Park, Olympic National Park, Sequoia National Park, plus the Grand Canyon, plus Denali, which is huge, plus the Great Smoky Mountains. You add up all those parks, still less than 20 million acres. So Homegrown National Park will be the biggest park in the country. What do you get when you put a park at home? What do you get when you put some part of nature right where you live? You get the opportunity to interact with that part of nature. It's your own time, your own pace. All you have to do is go outside, or maybe even just look out your window. You can avoid crowds. You know, if you go to real national park, 375 million people there with you. That was the figure last year. So I know what you're really going to interact with. It's free. There's no admission fee. It's never closed, no matter what pandemic or government closure comes down the pike. No travel hassles. You get to experience the natural world alone, which I think that alone part is important. It's not mediated by somebody else. It's your own personal relationship with Mother Nature. And it's particularly important for our poor kids who are suffering from nature deficit disorder, according to Richard Louv. So we're trying. We get 30 kids. We put them on a bus with a teacher, and they drive for an hour to a natural area. They walk around for an hour. Teacher tells them not to touch anything. Then they get back on the bus and they go home, and that's their experience with the natural world, which I'm sure is better than nothing. But it's really been an experience with 30 other kids and a teacher telling them not to touch anything. If they have some part of nature right where they live, all they have to do is go outside and get to know it, become comfortable with it, fall in love with it, alone. No parental supervision. When we hover over our kids as parents, we are sending the message that this is dangerous stuff. This is something you should be afraid of. Our kids are afraid enough already. It's a terrible message to be sending to the future stewards of the planet. If they don't know what good stewardship is, if they don't love being a good steward, they will be lousy stewards, and we can't afford any more lousy stewardship. And maybe they will learn how to hunt lizards. I'm learning this from my own granddaughter, Zoe, who lives in Hawaii on a very modest patch of nature. It's a little piece of lawn with a hedge, but there are anole lizards there. And when she discovered that, she sent me this picture to describe how you hunt lizards. You get on the ground, you cover yourself with leaves and sticks so the lizards can't see you coming. Then you crawl very slowly toward the lizard. No smiling. This is serious business. You can wear your best dress, that's okay, but you sneak up on the lizard. You catch the lizard, you put it in an aquarium, you learn how to take care of that lizard. You learn how to be a good steward of that piece of nature. You fall in love with that piece of nature. Now, I don't think Zoe's going to be crawling on the ground in her best dress, catching lizards the rest of her life. I don't think. She sent me this picture not long ago, so who knows? But I guarantee she's going to remember these experiences the rest of her life, and I guarantee she's going to be a good steward of the planet. If you want to join Homegrown National Park, you can do it. We are a real nonprofit at this point. Just go to our website, homegrownnationalpark.org, and register your property on the map, the biodiversity map. What you're doing is putting your location and the amount of area on your property that you're going to be a good steward of. Maybe if you have lawn, maybe you are going to reduce the area in lawn. Maybe you're going to plant an oak tree or some other, keystone plant, which we'll talk about in a minute. Maybe you're going to put an aster in a flower pot. Maybe you live in an apartment and you're going to do container gardening. It doesn't matter how modest it is. And then that area goes in our database, and your little piece of your county will light up with a firefly. That's our emblem there. And then you can see who else in your county, not who else, but how many other people have joined Homegrown National Park. And of course, our mission is to get the entire country to light up with fireflies. Canada's playing this game now too. We're actually talking to England, so who knows? Maybe we'll be worldwide soon. What's our mission? It's to motivate millions of people. Millions of people don't know this. We want to motivate millions of these people to regenerate biodiversity in the way that you regenerate biodiversity, by planting natives, by removing the non-natives that don't support biodiversity, and in so doing, building a culture that is sympathetic to the needs of conservation. There are real ecological products associated with Homegrown National Park, and one is a significant increase in biodiversity. And when I look at what's happened at our house, it convinces me this works. Nature is really resilient. If you give it half a chance, it will rebuild itself. Measurable reduction in invasive species. If we all got rid of the invasive plants just on our property, we'd be 78% done nationwide, 85% done in the East. Not completely done, but it's a very good first step. Significant drawdown of atmospheric CO2. Lawn is the worst plant for sequestering carbon. So if we replace it with any other type of planting, we're going to help climate change. And we're going to build viable habitat outside of parks and preserves. Any bit of conservation we do outside of a park is going to help conservation inside of the park. There are also really important sociological products of Homegrown National Park. And one is a national awareness, not just of what the problems are, but what the solutions are and what our roles in those solutions are. We truly are trying to change the culture. We want people to recognize that nature's not optional. It's not just there for our entertainment. It's essential. It's essential for everybody, which means everybody owns responsibility to sustaining it. We want to convert hope into action. Hope is good, but action's even better. And we want to merge all of the existing conservation organizations onto one visual, that biodiversity map. Audubon, National Wildlife Federation, Wild Ones, all the land conservancies, they're all over the country, and they're doing wonderful conservation on private property, but nobody's measuring it. We want to get it onto the map so we can see where the gaps are, so we can see how close we are to the 30 by 30 initiative. It's a measure of how well we're spreading this vital message. So we're going to reduce the lawn. What plants are we going to put in the area that was once lawn? I'm going to argue that some of them have to be keystone plants. Remember what a keystone is. It's a stone in the middle of the Roman arch. If you take it out of the arch collapses. Well, if you take keystone plants out of the local food web, the food web collapses, because those are the plants making those caterpillars that drive that food web. Just 14% of our native plants are making 90% of the caterpillar food that drives those food webs. So think of the keystone plants and the ecological houses you're building as the 2x4s that hold that house up. They are the support system. House isn't going to stand without them. You can't build a house out of wallpaper, and that's what we've been trying to do for the last century. Again, the best keystone plant as you move around the country is oaks. 270 species of caterpillars on oaks in California, 557 species of caterpillars on oaks in Pennsylvania, over 950 species nationwide. So there's no other plant genus that comes close to that. But if you want to know how, if you want to know what the best plants are where you live, you go to Native Plant Finder on National Wildlife Federation website, put in your zip code, and the rank list of the most important woody plants and herbaceous plants will pop up for your county. Now, these are examples here, and the list is much bigger than that. So the old excuse of not knowing what is best to plant where you live is just an excuse. Now that you have Native Plant Finder, you do know what the best plants are. So we're going to shrink the lawn. We are going to use keystone plants, invite a lot of insects to our yard, and then we're going to kill them with our security light, which of course is not the goal. It turns out that light pollution is one of the major causes of insect declines, and these are all the ways that lights are killing our nocturnal insects, particularly the moths that make the caterpillars that run our food web. But this is actually good news to me. It is a really, really serious environmental problem with our really, really easy solution. The easiest solution, of course, is to turn the lights off. There's a lot of lights to turn off, but there's a lot of us to do that. And I know the argument, you can't turn your light out because the bad man will come. We'll put a motion sensor on your security light, so it only turns on when the bad man does come. And if you don't want to do that, even easier is take the white bulb out of your security light and put in a yellow bulb. Nocturnal insects are not attracted to yellow wavelengths. If you really want to go all out, put in a red light bulb because they're not at all attracted to red, but then you're in a red light district. You know, if people were to switch out their white bulbs for yellow lights overnight, we would save millions of insects. And if you use yellow LEDs, we would save millions of dollars too. So we're going to shrink the lawn. We're going to use keystone plants. We're going to modify our light system. Then we're going to invite Mosquito Joe, the mosquito foggers, to come and kill all of our insects. Major problem around the country, but I don't think that's happening in Utah. Okay, there are 4 things we need to do. And the 4th thing is to landscape in a way that allows caterpillars to complete their development. This is just an example. I'm really talking about how we landscape under the trees that we do have. In Chester County, Pennsylvania, where I live, there are 511 species of caterpillars that develop on oaks. A few of them, like the Polyphemus moth, complete their development on the tree. The caterpillar eats the leaves, then it spins a cocoon and hangs from one of the branches, then it emerges as an adult, then it does it all over again. And I wish everything did that, but most species don't. 94% of them finish growing as caterpillars on the tree, and then they drop from the tree, and they wiggle their way underneath the ground and pupate underground, or they spin a cocoon in the leaf litter that's under the tree. And that's the problem. There is no leaf litter under the tree. We don't tolerate it. It's messy. And we mow and compact the area under our trees so that it's rock hard, particularly in the summertime. So the caterpillars drop from the tree and essentially die. These are oak trees. This becomes an ecological trap. It calls in the adult moths. They lay their eggs, the caterpillars develop, and then they drop down and die. And of course, the cement landscape is not the answer either. Now, this is what most people do. They have a tree in a yard. I just finished up a master student, Emma Jonas, who was looking at how well caterpillars do in a situation like this versus a layered landscape like this. This is what Heather Holm calls a soft landing. The caterpillars drop down. The soil is not compacted. That turns out to be key. There's plenty of leaf litter down here, and nobody's walking on it. Nobody's mowing it. So the caterpillars don't get squished. The pupae make it through the winter, much higher survivorship. And you can do that too in the drier West. It's a little bit more of a challenge in the West, I know, but staying out from the area underneath your trees is a way to not squish those overwintering pupae. Any of the ground covers that you usually have are wonderful sites for these caterpillars to pupate. So dry does not mean you can't do it. Former grad student Desiree Narango did some wonderful work with chickadees in the suburbs of Washington, D.C. And I know these examples are from the East, but they pertain, there's generalities that pertain everywhere. She had one simple question, and her results suggest there is room for compromise in our plant choices, and compromise is a good thing. She wanted to know how well chickadee populations do in suburban landscapes that are dominated with native plants compared to suburban landscapes dominated with typical introduced ornamentals. And when they're dominated with introduced ornamentals, they produce 75% fewer caterpillars. So right away, you've reduced the amount of bird food by 75%. They were 60% less likely to have breeding chickadees at all. So everybody had a nest box up in their yard, but the chickadees would come and look around and say, hey, there's not enough food here. We are not even going to try to breed. If they did try to breed, they laid 1.5 fewer eggs. Those clutches were 29% less likely to survive at all. If they did survive, they produced 1.2 fewer fledglings, and it took them 1.5 days longer to do that. And if you put all that into a population growth model as a function of the percentage of non-native woody plant biomass in your yard, from none to 100%, this is what you get. And the reason we looked at woody plant biomass is because that's where chickadees forage, on woody plants. This dotted line is replacement rate. This is the rate the population has to make babies to replace the adults that die every year. Chickadees don't live that long. And if they breed at this rate, you have a sustainable population. It's not growing, but it's not shrinking either. If you make more babies that die, anything above the line here, you have a growing population. And that's what happens when you have very few non-native plants. But if you're below the line over here, we got a lot of non-native plants, then you have an unsustainable shrinking population. Right here, very liberally speaking, is where those lines intersect, which suggests you can have up to 30% of your woody plant biomass non-native without collapsing the food web. Now, we can't tolerate any invasive plants. Invasive plants are just ecological tumors. They don't stay where we plant them. But a lot of ornamentals are not invasive. Remember Dan Getman? This is a ginkgo tree. I don't know if you picked that up the first time. Why does Dan have a ginkgo from China in his native plant landscape? Well, Dan's wife likes ginkgos, and Dan likes his wife, so he planted a ginkgo. The question is the ginkgo going to ruin the ecological productivity of this landscape? No, it's not. It's just there. It's not doing anything. Is it going to escape and wreck the food web? No. It's not invasive. It's just there. So I like to think of trees that are just there, not doing anything, but not really doing any harm either, as if they're ornamental statues. So there you go. There's Dan's statue. If everything in Dan's landscape was a statue, he would not have a productive landscape. But the point I'm trying to make here is that it's not the presence of non-native plants that destroys food webs. It's the absence of the native plants that support those food webs. If we increase these, then we can tolerate many of these. Can we use native plants in formal landscapes? Of course we can. This is a Lynn O'Shaughnessy design. You don't get more formal than that. This was taken by a drone 400 feet up. Every plant in that landscape is a native plant. Formality is a function of the design. It's not a function of the plants in the design. Our native plants are used in formal designs in Europe every day. Of course, they're non-native over there, but the Europeans love them. If the Europeans can love our native plants, maybe we can too. Can we get a pollinator garden into a suburban yard like this without offending anybody? Of course we can. Put a little fence around it. It formalizes it. It tells your neighbor it's not a bunch of weeds you forgot to mow. It's pretty when it's in bloom. It's meeting the needs of several species of native bees. It's not very big. Could be bigger. But if everybody did it, it would help a lot. Help what? Help make pollinators. Why do we need pollinators? Well, the media will tell you because they pollinate a third of our crops. It's actually more like a 1/12 of our crops. And I hear people say, oh, I don't live next to a farm, so I don't need any pollinators. Forget the crop argument. We need pollinators everywhere we need plants because they're pollinating 80% of all plants and 90% of all flowering plants, including a few of our crops. How about this? A Drew Latham design, much bigger. Imagine the amount of life supported here versus the amount of life supported here. Seems like a no-brainer. So I think we made 3 missteps in the early years of conservation, and the first one's serious. We're starting to think of nature as if it's optional. It's not that we don't like it. We do like nature. We like to bird watch or just go for a walk, commune with nature, but it's not essential. And if it's not essential, when push comes to shove, when resources are in short supply, which is always, nature takes a back seat. Went to the Cincinnati Zoo, and there's this wall-sized poster there, which to me epitomizes our society's view of conservation. We want to save nature, we want to save wildlife so that future generations can enjoy it. That was Teddy Roosevelt's argument for expanding the national park system. We want to save these places because they're so beautiful and we want future generations to enjoy it. And I get that because nature is enormously entertaining, but it is much more than that. We need to save nature so that we have future generations. It's a little bit more urgent. We also assume that humans and nature cannot coexist, and we talked about that. But if we restrict conservation just to the places where there's not a lot of humans, we're going to fail because those places are too small, too isolated, and there's too few of them. David Quammen has an excellent analogy between a Persian rug and an ecosystem. This is a functional Persian rug. That is not 71 Persian rugs. That's 71 rug fragments, none of which are acting like a Persian rug. And that's what we've done to our ecosystems. The UN designates biosphere reserves as places of ecological significance. And I don't like that language because it suggests there's places on planet Earth with no ecological significance. Not so. Every square inch of the planet has ecological significance, including our yards, including our corporate landscapes, including our roadsides, even including much of our agriculture. So we need to glue our rug back together again, folks. We've got to put the plants back, not just to make biological corridors that allow plants and animals to move back and forth between viable habitats, but to recreate viable habitats in all those places we've destroyed them. The good news is it's starting to happen. It is actually starting to happen. And when it does, it'll be the first time in modern history that we humans actually have coexisted with the natural world. Our third misstep was to leave Earth stewardship to just a few specialists, few conservation biologists, few ecologists. For some reason, we didn't see it as an inherent responsibility of everybody on the planet. But I don't know why, since every single person on the planet depends entirely on the quality of local ecosystems. So why wouldn't everybody share the responsibility of taking care of those ecosystems? Stan Rushworth, a Cherokee elder, once said, the Western settler mindset was, I have rights. The mindset of indigenous people is, I have obligations. You're not born with those mindsets, you're taught them. We have been very good at teaching this one. We have been terrible at teaching our kids and our peers that we all have obligations to good Earth stewardship. That does not mean you have to save biodiversity for a living, but you can save it where you live, and if you do, it empowers you. More and more people recognize the Earth has some serious issues, but they feel powerless. What can one person do? Well, one person can shrink the lawn, one person can modify their lights, one person can put in a pollinator garden, one person can use keystone plants, one person can remove their invasives, one person can fire Mosquito Joe. There's a whole bunch of things that one person can do to revitalize ecosystem productivity on their piece of the Earth, and then enhance their local ecosystem instead of continuing to degrade it. And this is important. It shrinks the problem down to something that's manageable for each one of us. Don't think about the entire planet's problems. You get depressed. Just think about the piece of the Earth that you can influence. If you own property, it's obvious. That's where you start. If you don't own property, help somebody who does. Help a land conservancy, help a park or preserve. They are all underfunded. They're all understaffed. They will love you as a volunteer. So as property owners or as volunteers, each one of us has the power and the responsibility to fix landscapes like this. And whether or not we do so is going to determine nature's fate and then ultimately our own. Robert Swan recently said the greatest threat to our planet is believing that someone else will save it. It won't be someone else. It'll be you. I'll help, but it's going to be you. You are nature's best hope. Thanks very much. Here are those websites that I mentioned.
Fantastic. I'm trying to find my my clapping emojis, and I'm just not able to find them. I can hear the claps. I'm going to turn on my video here. And we can take a few questions. I don't know how long do we have you for, Doug?
Oh, until I get tired.
Okay. Okay. So I will ask people to put questions in the chat and be patient with us because there's a lot of you and just a couple of us to try to get to.
And only one of me.
Yeah. So here's one. How do you feel about plants being slightly out of their native range? If a plant is native in a different habitat, 30 minutes away, is it still likely to benefit the specialists that depend on it?
You know, in the East, I would say no problem. If that 30 minutes is straight up a mountain where you're going to an entirely different ecoregion, that could be a problem. You definitely want to stay in the same ecoregion. 30 minutes away. That, insects are quite mobile. They get around. But people are talking about assisted migration. Like in California, they want to move oaks up from San Diego to San Francisco. I do not favor that. Look at what's happening in the country today. Baton Rouge had 9 inches of snow. It got down to 9 degrees, first time ever. That's because the jet stream is going crazy. Wild swings of the jet stream. That's a feature of climate change. So yeah, it gets unusually warm, but then it gets unusually cold. And if we start moving plants up from the south, they're not going to make it. And if you move them far away, then you're moving them away from the plants and animals they co-evolved with. And then they're not doing their job. So this is controversial. People disagree with me, but I think we should leave them where they are and hope they have the genetic variability to withstand these crazy things that we are throwing at them.
Great. And maybe questions back up.
Sorry. That was the one I saw earlier.
Another question for Doug.
From Skylar, you helped inspire the founding of our nursery, Cache Valley Native Plants. I think that's a good one to read to you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
There's a great question. We have people asking, they do have ginkgo trees. They're not native to Utah. Should they leave them or chop them down? It depends on your marriage, right?
Yeah, that's it. You have a big tree. I would rather say don't buy them in the nursery anymore. There are other things you can use. Chopping them down is a big move. But if they die and fall down, then replace them with something more productive. They're not native to Utah. They're not native to any place in the country. So, they're way out of zone.
Oh, yes, it does.
So
good question from Sandra.
The Native Plant Finder gives us a list of plants based on zip code, but it doesn't point out which ones are keystone. Is there a way to look that up?
They're ranked. So the ones at the top of the list. So it gives you a little number, and anything that's supporting a lot of caterpillars is a keystone plant.
Yeah, Sandra. So anything that you find in there is a keystone.
Fantastic. This is kind of a fun question. What's your favorite moth?
The one I haven't seen yet. It's the one I haven't seen yet. There are about 14,000 species of moths and butterflies in this country.
Oh.
It's about 2,000 are not even named yet. So yeah, we're always looking for the one that we haven't seen yet, or the one I haven't gotten a good picture of yet.
Great. I think Sandra found that.
Good question.
Yeah. So let's see. In Washington County, which is the Mojave Desert, really, there's not much variety or availability with the top, quote, keystone species. What can be the biggest impact if there isn't an oak or pine available?
Every ecoregion, every habitat has the most productive plants. Every habitat is not as productive as every other habitat, but you go with the ones that are most productive in that habitat. Now, there's a weakness in the native plant finder, and that is it's by county, which is that's not an ecoregion, that's a political boundary. And the counties in the West tend to be huge, which means they go through several different ecoregions. That's a weakness. And the National Wildlife Federation actually hired 2 women to help convert that whole data set into ecoregions so that it's more specific to particular places where you live. If you live in California, you're lucky because they've already done that. They've got something called CalScape. Every single native plant is geo-referenced in the state, and you can see where you live and see exactly where that plant occurs, and then you know what works. It's a wonderful system, and I wish every state did what California has done.
So there's another question about who you're collaborating with to develop the list of host plants for the Intermountain West. It seems like we still need a lot of research in this area.
We get our data on host plants from the literature. We go all the way back to the 1800s. Who has recorded an insect eating this particular plant? So we're not out actually testing all the plants. That would take many lifetimes to do that. It's the many lifetimes of people who have already done that and written it down. So the Native Plant Finder is based on over 4,000 references, and we're getting ready to publish the latest updated list of every plant genus in the country and where they occur. That's going to happen this year. So it'd be, and then you can go there, you can look at all the productive plants, the unproductive plants, and exactly where they are. So it'll be Shropshire and Tallamy. It's Kimberly Shropshire who actually put this list together. She's my helper. But that'll be out this year.
Great. There was something about, I think we have been trying to get this message out there, but a lot of the large nurseries will grow their plants with neonicotinoids, and just something to be aware of, and or what do you suggest? I mean, I've had the dream of going up to every nursery manager and demanding they know and show me which ones are grown with those.
Well, that's a start. I mean, the nurserymen are getting it that people don't want to buy plants with neonics in them. But, I have some sympathy to the situation here. I just lectured about whiteflies today in my insect taxonomy class. It is really tough to grow plants in a greenhouse without pest problems for whiteflies, thrips, and spider mites. As a matter of fact, it's almost impossible. So they put the neonicotinoids in, it protects the plants, and then they sell them. The way to do it without neonics is to actually grow the plants outside, because then you don't need those, you don't have those pest problems. But the neonics don't last forever. But if you're buying milkweed, for example, to help the monarch that season, they do last that season, and you need to be aware of that. So it's I don't know, find a specialty nursery who agrees to grow them without neonics and see how it turns out. It's a really intractable problem. So
I might just comment on that. And for the first time ever, the Monarch Watch milkweed market will sell showy milkweed, or Asclepias speciosa, by the flat, and it will be grown without any neonics, and they ship. And I posted that in our Facebook group, Friends of Monarchs. But right now it's just going to be the showy milkweed. But stay tuned, because we can certainly get other milkweeds in the next few years. It'll be grown in Arizona again, in a pesticide-free environment.
do you have antelope milkweed?
Yes,
Yeah.
Yeah.
we
Yep.
have what, 17-ish species?
So yeah, something like that. Yeah, we've grown a few of them and have had quite a bit of luck. The plants that come from the Pollinator Habitat Program are grown at our state prison, and they do not have access to neonicotinoids.
Oh,
So
that's great. What a great thing for them to be doing. Yeah.
yeah, they've been very appreciative, and yeah, it's been a great aspect of the program. Somebody else asks about a population of snails that eat up my plant seedlings. Fairly sure they're European snails. Should I try to get rid of them, or make room for native species, or just be glad for any living critters in there?
Well, they are from Europe, and talk about host plant generalists. They eat pretty much anything. So it's another of a gardener's challenges. Snails do well in high humidity. If you're watering your plants or your little garden area a lot, the snails will do really well. They hate low humidity. They hate dryness. So maybe you can use that to your advantage. Put out beer traps. If you put out beer in a pan, they crawl into it and drown. But there's no reason to try to keep the snails around.
Here's another one. Have you been observing host plant species preferences in Lepidoptera, even if the literature states they are generalists on a particular family?
That's another paper I haven't published yet. Even our most generalist Lepidoptera only use 14% of the available plants, which
Wow.
means even our most generalized insects are still somewhat specialized. Um, when it says it eats a particular genus or a particular family, have they tested every species of plant in that genus or family? No way. How about asters? Aster,
Yeah.
huge family. Can it eat all of them? Doubtful. It's doubtful. Uh, but so much of the literature is recorded at the genus level. So like eats oaks or eats
Oh,
eats
right.
goldenrods. That's all we have. So rather than throw all that data out, that's what we say. But yeah, room for a lot more research.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I that one. You wanna?
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, it's definitely worth asking. Some of the local arborists recommend we spray the aspens for aphids and some other tiny white insect for our pines. Should they be sprayed? If yes, what is safe use for spray? Ugh, slippery slope.
I am not an arborist, and I don't know your aspen pest problems there. I do know that you want to be cautious about taking advice from somebody who will make money when you take that advice. I suppose the arborist will be spraying the spray and charging you for it. Just because there's an insect on a tree or a plant does not mean it's going to hurt the plant or that it's bad. If you have no insects on your trees, you've got no birds, you've got no food web. So we spray a little bit more often than we should. I would, if it were me, I wouldn't do it, but I'd want to live there and see what the issues are. I mean, out east, we've got gypsy moth, and there are times where it's appropriate if you want to save a particular tree, but it's case specific, and you have to be very cautious about it because when you spray, you kill everything on the tree. And then you've ended the food web contributions of that tree. And for oaks, that's a serious blow.
Hmm. Here's another one sort of in that vein. Non-native European paper wasps predate many of our urban produced caterpillars.
They do.
Yeah. Any suggested management of those?
No, I don't know. They're everywhere, particularly in the West, and it is a huge problem. They eat a lot of caterpillars.
Hmm.
It's just another one of our introduced things that are going crazy.
Yeah.
I don't know. Ask AI if it knows how to control
AI knows everything, right? That
everything. Yeah.
might be interesting to see see what it says. Anyway, I am still trying to get used to AI. It just seems to be everywhere.
Better because
Whether
it's
you
here
want
to
it,
stay.
yeah, whether you want it to be or not. So, oh, and here, of course, is the question: what are your thoughts on nativars? Should we avoid them altogether?
No, that's too extreme. Right now, you go to the nursery. That's mostly what's there. A nativar, it's a cultivar of a native plant. So it's promoting a particular trait that has either been selected for by natural selection in the wild, and they bring them in and put a name on it, or humans have selected for it. So it depends on what that trait is. We did a study comparing 6 traits in woody plants, not the flowers, but the plants themselves. So if you take a tall plant, make it short. If you introduce disease resistance, if you take a green leaf and make it red or purple, and the only trait that actually impacted insects was taking the green leaf and making it red or purple, because that loads the leaf with anthocyanins, which are feeding deterrents. Now, if you fool with flowers, that's almost certainly going to impact specialist pollinators because they're really tightly tuned in to the shape of the flower, the UV spectrum, the quality of the nectar and the pollen. And when you make an echinacea look like a zinnia, first of all, why would you do that? But sure, it's going to affect the specialist pollinators. When you make a double flower, you're taking the reproductive parts of the flower and turning them into petals. So it's really pretty, but you've ruined the any value for pollinators. But there are cases. There's a cultivar of Phlox paniculatum called Jenna. It was found in the mountains of Georgia, and it has twice the petals of the straight species. And guess what? It supports twice the pollinators as the straight species. The big problem I have with cultivars is that they're propagated clonally, zero genetic variability, and we know that it's not a good idea. If they could promote a trait and still have it genetically diverse, I'd have far less problem with it. Having said all of that, I'd rather have you get a cultivar of a native plant than a plant from Asia. So everything is relative. You know?
So here's one that's close to my heart these days. I've been demoralized with the issues of late, particularly environmental. How do you stay encouraged?
Look, how many people are on the call tonight? 150, 158?
Yeah.
That's what encourages me. When I
Oh,
say you're nature's best hope, I mean it. It's there's more and more people interested in doing something. Something positive on 78% of the country. I do care what the government does, but we're not going to depend on them anymore. We're going to depend on us. That's what gives, and more people are interested. They feel empowered to do this. That's what keeps me hopeful.
Great answer.
yeah, indeed. Let's see. Happiness. People are mentioning other books.
I see that how to lepidopter locate isolated plants. They smell them. That's what their antennae are for. They're flying through the air, and every plant's putting up. We won't call it an odor. We'll call it a perfume, and they simply zero in on it because there's a lot of plants out there, and they've got to find the right one. How does a monarch find that milkweed? It smells it.
That's pretty amazing. Yeah. Anyway, I have often wondered what it would be like to have a dog's nose just for a day and be able to process all of those smells. Like, what does the world really smell like?
It's smelly.
Yeah, I think it would be a little overwhelming. So, pollinator have, hey boy, how far those aromas can travel. So, that's from the same person asking, how do they zero in on those plants?
Yeah.
And how far
In real life, we don't know. We do know that male antennae on some Saturniid moths can pick up the female pheromone. We used to say 20 miles away. It's probably closer to 5 miles away, but that's still a long way. Very single molecules floating along, and they can pick it up. The trick then is finding it though, because you've got to pick up enough of them to be able to follow it back to the source. A plant, how far does an oak tree smell? I have no idea. Yeah.
I get that molecule sensor somewhere.
Yeah.
There's pollen accessed by schools. So the Pollinator Habitat Program can be used for schools. So just so you know, that's a question that came to us, Marcy.
Now's a good time to apply, Marcy.
Yep. I think unless we get one coming in the next few seconds, I think we have come.
What a wealth of information.
Yeah.
Let's see.
Is there evidence to suggest human activity may be interfering with insects' ability to geolocate these plants?
I'm sure it is.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
We're interfering with everything.
these are all great questions that make great research questions, but research is expensive. Typically, you need to have a grad student. That grad student costs, $35,000 a year. Did you guys just disappear?
No, I don't know what happened. It went
We've
to the
been
whiteboard. Sorry.
Oh, boy.
There we go.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
And you need that for, well, at least 3 years just for a master's.
What happened?
Somebody.
Sorry, I'm gonna get that out. Okay.
Okay. And this is and then you get the big funding agencies like NSF or USDA, and they only fund novel research. If it's been done once, they won't fund it again. So got about a 7-8% funding rate, and it doesn't mean 93% of the grants they get are bad. So it is difficult. We're going crazy here. I think somebody
We've
wants
been-
this.
Yeah.
Well, before we lose everybody or anything, just want to remind people that we will send a quick follow-up email. Look for that probably tomorrow. We will have links to all of this information. Any of the questions that you have that